And now we're going to have a panel. The topic of the panel is what's the role of the markets and the public policies in attaining net zero emission. We have very valuable speakers, two speakers, to look for answer to the question. And the panels are Alberto Carlo Pineda, CDP's Science-Based Targets Initiative Director, TEPAV Global Executive Director Güven Sak, and Masa Ararat. Once again, hello, all the participants. The topic of today's panel, in fact, is to understand the interaction between the markets and the public policies in attaining net zero emission. When we were choosing the topic of this panel, in fact, we took into consideration the recent developments. First, we scanned the researches in all times in the fields of social sciences. About 3,700 articles. Just 400 are related to climate change, and in fact climate change, carbon emissions and their economic impacts are covered in these researches and the articles. In fact, in the research and literature, we see an increasing interest in our topic. In January, the Columbia University and the Imperial College academicians published a very interesting study. This is a global multi-end research, and it could shed some light onto today's discussions. CDP data was used for this study. Just for scope 1 emission, the disclosures of the companies, in fact, reduced uncertainty, and those companies became more attractive for the investors. And the investors expected low capital proceeds from these companies. So the disclosure of emission figures, in fact, reduced the capital cost for the companies. That is proven now by this study. That is why this study is an important one. As a result of this study, we can say that emission reporting and emission research should be mandatory. Also, very recently, in the last couple of weeks, there have been some important new developments. For example, on the 3rd of March, the US Capital Board's regulator, SEC, made a statement saying that a new task force was established to deal with climate change. From now on, not just the companies, but also the investors and investment advisors are going, and their disclosures will be regulated, and it will be checked whether their disclosures are realistic or not. So they will intervene. It means that the market will be required to do correct pricing, and SEC would be engaged in the process. About 1 week later, on the 9th of March, International Reporting Foundation announced that the climate-related elements would be included in the financial reporting. And towards the end of March, there was even some bigger development. BlackRock and Vanguard joint net zero portfolio managers initiative. And the companies in their portfolio will have at average a zero ratio for the net zero emissions. Now, after all these news, I would like to continue with you, Güven. And I am asking you, Güven, what is happening? So about climate change and public policies, what is happening? Are we seeing a quantum leap? So does climate change has a meaning beyond climate change? What did change? around the world, how Turkey will be affected, and what can you say based on the results of the report?
Thank you indeed, Melsa. Thank you for the kind introduction. Many things have changed. Many things have changed. In the first video that we have seen, we can compare the things today and 20 years ago very well. So in the last 20 years, many important changes have occurred, and the big majority of the changes have happened in the last 1 year only. Well, 20 years ago, corporations and financial people, financial institutions considered climate change related activities to be corporate social responsibility or something only. They were in the circles of debates, discussions to a certain extent, but as of 2020, now this topic placed itself at the core of discussions, core of debates. And in the past, there were a bunch of NGOs debating about this topic. Now we have SEC, the central banks will come to the foreground more frequently. And also, the they say that they're going to consider the impacts of the instruments on the carbon emissions, etc. So these are all at the core of the agenda. The whole climate change issue is at the core. And the humanitarian development report of UNDP also announced today made it evident that women participation in labor force will be important, and inequalities between the genders will be considered, but also what is going on for the planet. The cost for the planet will also be considered when making a ranking, when doing a ranking between the countries in humanitarian development, UNDP suggested. So things are changing, something is changing, and the climate change is now at the heart of the discussions, at the debates. And let me share a couple of dates with you and develop on them later on. First of all, 2015 Paris Agreement, which mobilized the countries to put climate change at the core of their agendas. So this started with 195 countries, I believe 195. Those governments came together to sign the agreement. This was an important development. And then in 2019, Ursula von der Leyen announced that the growth strategy of the European Union would be the Green Deal. And we didn't know back then in 2019 the potential impacts of coronavirus, but still she came along with this announcement, with this statement. Then came the taxation of taxation at the border, etc., for carbon emissions. And then came the virus, outbreak of virus. Especially recovery, bouncing back after coronavirus, have been discussed very much in 2021, and people have concluded that public investment should be there for building back together. Especially, this provided an important meaning to the Green Deal announced in December. Now we are expecting the Biden administration to release their targets. And also, there will be a high-level climate change conference, in USA. And in USA, they call it Green New Deal. This is a new name they assigned to this whole topic in USA. And Boris Johnson, about G20 April conference meeting, he said this carbon and offsetting and carbon taxation can be on the foreground. So we are talking about a new area of trade, a new commercial area, and at the foundation of this area, we have the climate change framework. We have the framework for fighting climate change at the bottom line. That's why all of these topics became important. First of all, new technologies new technologies showed us that a non-carbon based growth can be possible, right? Especially in developed countries with higher income, we could see that the connection between carbon emissions and development had already been detached, and it was not achieved overnight. And now, and now we can see some more developments on this side, and we are talking about the richest market of the world. Every country around the world is trying to somehow contact this market. That is why that is why developments happening in the developed countries will also occur in our countries very soon, hopefully. So new technologies are showing us that non-carbon emission development growth is possible in the world, in our countries. And also building back together is required in the public. And also thirdly, as you said previously, Melsa, we're not talking about climate policies today when we make reference to Green Deal. We are talking about a new area of commerce, a new area of trade where the new technologies will be implemented to the trade, will be applied to the trade. We are talking about new trade policies at the heart, and we are talking about the shaping of new foreign policies. We're going to see new foreign policies shaping coming to the foreground because some countries will be impacted negatively, especially in 20 years or 30 years, petroleum countries, selling petroleum will be impacted negatively. And for Turkey as well, some security policies will have to be changed because Turkey is strategically located between, at the junction of the petroleum selling countries. We will require some developments of new policies. And considering the G20 involvement of Turkey, we can say that a big portion of the Turkish trade goes to those G20 countries. Well, CDP gives us nice numbers and figures. This is so much important that we see increase the number of leaders in the sector attaching great importance to disclosures. But I think what was important is to have increased number of corporations who are aware of all of these things that I mentioned before. That's why this carbon accounting, especially carbon accounting, this topic, this methodology, is number one topic that everyone will be covering, will be discussing, because along the supply chain, along the value chain, especially in water scope, along the supply chain, the carbon accounting will have to be done robustly. This is the stage that we are in at the moment. We have to do robust carbon accounting and we have to be prepared, very well prepared for this stage. And it's very nice. Some of the corporations in Turkey have started this stage already, but the numbers are not enough. If you're talking about 60% of the exporting companies, 1,500 companies in CDP disclosures, it means that we need a lot more corporations to come on board on CDP disclosures. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you very much for the kind attention. Thank you very much, Güven. Very nice, very important. All of these are important for especially reducing costs of new technologies in wind, in solar systems. These are all impactful on a number of issues at once, and the balance around the world is changing, and we're talking about a rapidly changing process, and Turkey will have to place itself in the changing world, it seems, right? But on the other hand, a big majority of the corporations in Turkey are not doing this CDP disclosures because of corporate social responsibilities, but because of the way of doing business. Well, the number of the corporations doing CDP disclosures may not be so high, too high, but they make up an important portion of the sector, especially in scope 3. In scope 3, if we can achieve increased numbers of corporations on this platform, then we can achieve an increased coverage of the economy in Turkey, considering all carbon emissions and trade. Carbon trade. We will move on into English from now on. All the discussions will take in English, and Alberto will also speak in English, and you can listen to his Turkish interpretation in the Turkish channel from now on. But before that, let me say once again that from now on, I'll continue in Turkish. I'm sorry, in English. Alberto, the floor is yours, sir. Thank you.
Okay, Alberto, now my question to you. How has market pressure developed over the years? The investor action, carbon indices, regulators' efforts, and how are the leading companies are changing the competitive landscape? And I know that you're originally from Mexico, and Turkey and Mexico are the two accidental members of OECD, the wealthy nations. How do you compare the business response to climate risk in these two countries? Latin America has a special place because of its proximity to the US, and therefore the US regulators obviously has regulations have more impact on the regulatory space and business practice in Latin America as well. But what has happened in the markets over the years, and how is it going to affect the way the businesses behave?
Thanks a lot, Melsa, for this context. And I think, as you said, the accidental members of the OECD, and I would say also, the parallelism between the fact that Mexico is the gateway between South America and Latin America and North America, and I would say in a way also Turkey is the gateway between the East and Europe. And so I think we face very similar circumstances in that regard. And I would say from a global context, I think there's definitely a very rapid transition and transformation that we are seeing. I think we are still in the early phases of this transition, but there are clear signals of change that are happening from multiple points, including changes in the regulatory context, changes in expectations from investors, changes from expectations from consumers, from citizens, and also from companies in their supply chains. And these expectations are pretty much the same, right? I think, first of all, we have a clear framework that was adopted 5 years ago through the Paris Agreement. And through the Paris Agreement, we have a clear goal. We need to mitigate climate change. And in order to mitigate climate change, we need to move away from the current economic system where we have basically our activities being powered primarily through fossil fuels. And we need to move towards a system where basically we continue to create value for society, but where we don't rely anymore in the combustion of fossil fuels and in the release of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, right? That's the transition that we need to go through. It's an energy transition, but it's actually a major transition of the entire economy. And according to the Paris Agreement, we need to go through this transition. In the next 3 decades, we want to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And we know that is the threshold that we should avoid crossing, because beyond that, we enter into a dangerous zone in terms of unmanageable climate impacts, right? So we need to go through this transition in the next 3 decades. And if you consider the time that it takes for us to actually replace the assets that we have today, including infrastructure, roads, energy infrastructure, manufacturing facilities, and basically our entire economy, to replace all of that and to adjust it to an economy that basically is an emissions-free economy, we're talking about a massive challenge, right? We have clear signal coming from governments, not only through the adoption of the Paris Agreement 5 years ago, also in the past 12 months, we have seen an acceleration in the number of countries that are clearly committing to reach net zero emissions by mid-century. And this transformation is clearly sending a clear signal to other stakeholders in the economy. Today, we have about 3/4 of global emissions already covered in countries that aim to reach net zero emissions, right? And so it's clear signal coming from governments. Then in terms of investors, we have a growing number of initiatives and investors also clearly sending the signal that they want companies in their portfolios to reach net zero emissions by mid-century. We heard earlier in this event from Eric Usher about different initiatives in the UNFI, and I think the common factor is investors want to move in this direction. They want to see their portfolios decarbonized by mid-century, and of course, this is critical, especially for listed companies. And then finally, in terms of companies and what you were talking about in terms of supply chains and scope 3, and is the multiplier effect, right? An example that we have, and that makes us think about the speed of the transition that is needed, is we have more and more, for instance, automotive companies that are planning to transition from internal combustion engine to electric vehicles and to move towards zero emission vehicles, basically in the next 2 decades. Most large car manufacturers are already planning to do this. And of course, that is massive, not only in terms of the infrastructure that is needed to do this transition in the way we transport our goods and services and our people, but also in terms of the supply chains that are currently enabling the current infrastructure that is based on internal combustion engine and the type of vehicles that are going to be needed in the next decades. Right? So this signal is coming from everywhere. And I think the best thing we can do and the best thing companies can do is to understand that this transition is coming and to start taking action to align to this transition.
Thank you, Alberto. So it seems like there is a disparity between the capabilities of the developed nations and developing nations. So I'd like to turn to Güven again, and also related to your comments on that the companies that are aware of it and have the capacity and financial means to adopt. So how do companies would actually do that? Do you see particular risks for investors and companies in developing countries vis-a-vis the investors and companies in more advanced economies? And what is the role of regulators in that discussion? And you mentioned central banks, and provided that we have a sound central bank management, how would the financial management and monetary management would also come into the picture in developing countries?
Okay, thank you. Okay, let me, you are absolutely right. In Turkey nowadays, we are not discussing what central bank is going to do in this new Green Deal era yet. I hope we will start discussing these issues very soon. But let me start from my answer to your first question. So these technologies that are now going to transform more rapidly the existing sectors have already been around for some time. But the fact, the reason that the transition is slow, has been slow, I think, is due to the fixed capital investments that are needed, fixed investment needs to achieve this transformation. As these fixed investment needs are high, it's not low. That's kind of that was a hindering effect for all this process in the past. But now, due to the virus, especially in the advanced countries, in the Western markets, Western capital markets, the interest rates are, for government bonds are negative, are very low now at this moment. So things have become much more doable. So two things I think meet together. Low funding costs meet the need to provide an impetus to the economy at the outset after the virus. For post-virus recovery. I think these two things now meet each other. But this thing is happening only in the developed countries. So I think the issue for us, for the developing countries, is a little bit different. Let me put it that way. It is more problematic for countries that has, companies with high debt, highly indebted companies, with banks with troubled balance sheets, and also countries with high CDS risk premiums. We cannot compete with Mexico there in the risk premium basis, but we can compete with Brazil, I think, on that. Not Argentina, of course. So that makes the transition, or financing the transition, much harder for countries like us in this process. That's why I think the IFIs need to be more active in this process in order to achieve transition in our kind of countries. And
I think IMF has supported that discussion that you're just presenting us. It has more important role to play there, right?
It's weird, isn't it? IMF is talking about green transformation.
Amazing. This is not our grandmother's IMF anymore, right?
Yeah, this is a totally new world. So I mean, that's why it's a core issue now. That's why this debate was, in the fringes of the society in the past, but now it's mainstream. Now it's in the center at the moment. So I think one risk for our type of countries, if there is no attempt at the center in enabling such a transition in our type of countries, then it's going to be too costly for us, or impossible for us, for countries like us, to achieve this transformation. And that transformation is not easy. As Alberto has been trying to, has noted, some of the issues, especially the nature of the industries, etc., that we have. But we also need to have a look at, for example, in the car industry with electric cars, etc., the car itself is going to change. But in the case of cement, in the case of iron and steel, it's still going to be cement and iron and steel. So the technologies that are producing, that we are now using to produce those products are going to change. But that requires, massive investments. So I think that's the first issue, the IFI issue, and the nature of our industries. But secondly, I think what we need to take into account is the skill level of our labor force is also an important issue. Because when you compare, for example, Turkey and Germany, half of the German workforce is already working in more analytical works. But that is only 20% in Turkey. So if the movement is going to be through that direction, I think there is also a drive for vocational training in all our kinds of countries, and we need to speed up that process too. I mean,
Güven, seni duyamıyorum ben. Acaba mikrofonun mu kapandı?
Well, Güven, we cannot hear you.
We can't hear you, unfortunately. I think there is a technical problem.
I don't know.
Oh, now you're back.
Still, okay. Now let me repeat the second issue that I have been underlining. It's easy to say to a company that you need to achieve this transition, focus on these technologies, etc. We are supporting, the central bank is providing, discount facilities, etc. So everybody is helping you. The IFIs are providing, because the IFI loans, I think the IFI money is going to be directed to INDCs. The countries are going to produce from now on. So I think it's easy to say a company to adjust to this, but that those companies need to find that much better skilled workforce also at the same time. So I think it looks easy, but it is not that easy, but we still have time. And this thing is not going to happen in 2 years, in a decade, but it's going to take decades. So I think we have time to make our preparations. So let me stop here. Thank you.
Right, right. Such an interesting debate. And I think, yes, we are in the beginning of a new era, and let's see how things will develop. But I think one thing is for sure, that the markets and regulators and the governments need to work together to have a harmonized space for companies to have an easier, let's say, adjustment process. And are we back to industrial policies? I don't know, but
even IMF and the World Bank has gone back to the industrial policy here.
Exactly. So you know, there is never a straight development in history. So we never reach the end of history, as Crackman once said. So still things are changing. Well, I'll come back to Alberto again. So you are the CDP's expert, or let's say the man in charge of science-based targets. So how can regulations encourage, and the governments can encourage companies to set science-based targets? And how can the business action and policy become mutually reinforcing? Are there any examples of let's say, good practices whereby the businesses and the governments reach a consensus about the path forward, and then look for financing, obviously, this transition, and especially in the case of developing countries or less advanced economies like Mexico and Turkey, it is a big challenge, because there is also the political dimension to it, that who is voting for the governments in power, and not the few big businesses, but there are a lot of other dynamics in place. So how are the governments going to balance this need to stay in power and also support the transition?
Yeah. No, I think that's definitely a challenge. And sorry, there's a very high noise next to me. Give me just 1 second. Sorry, I hope you can hear me well. Well, I think governments can do several things. I think the first one is to send a clear signal about the direction of travel that is needed, and also that the rest of the economy is going through. Right now, we have a lot of conflicting signals coming from governments, and that is problematic because it doesn't help companies and financial institutions understand the transition that we are going through, right? And so it basically locks companies and financial institutions into the current state of the economy instead of helping catalyze this transition. And so I would say the first thing that we need is clarity, and yeah, to send the right signals to companies and financial institutions. Then I think the other thing that is important is to find ways to incentivize, and of course, you know, part of it will come directly through regulation, but there's also many other ways in which governments can help accelerate and incentivize companies to go through this transition. In some countries, for instance, there's public procurement programs that are helping incentivize companies, especially in these sectors that are very difficult to transition, such as cement, steel, etc., to you know, yeah, to procure low carbon materials that obviously is going to be more expensive than you know, high carbon materials at this point. But through public procurement, that can be actually a good lever to create those incentives and to accelerate the transition. There's also governments that are looking at, for instance, having incentives or requirements for companies to have science-based targets or to be in this transition so that they can actually supply goods and services to government entities. There's other governments that are supporting through capacity building because, yeah, as we know, that's a big gap that we have, and it's very difficult for companies to go through this transition if they are not even equipped to go through this transition, and if there's not enough human capacity. And so there's also a lot of effort going on to build capacity. And I think all of these things can help. I would say for me, if I had to choose one, the main one is to send a clear signal. This is a transition that is happening as other transitions that we have gone through. You know, it could be a fair transition. It could help close the gap between developing countries and developed countries, or it could be a transition that accelerates or widens this gap, right? We have seen that through the digital transformation and through other transformations of our economy. And so I think what we need to make sure is that we are prepared, especially in developing countries, to embrace this transition and to avoid that the gap is widened.
Well, we have 10 minutes left for the rest of this panel. And I would like to turn to both of you and given our audience that are companies, and hopefully we also have regulators listening to us. What would be your recommendations to companies and regulators going forward? Given you're of course more familiar with the Turkish context, so I would ask you to, speak with Turkey in mind, and I can ask Alberto to speak in general about developing countries and the recommendations for companies, especially in hard spaces, and also to regulators.
Okay. Let me start first what I am seeing, by saying what I'm seeing regarding, 5 years ago, 15 years ago, discussing about climate change related adjustment in the economy, in the corporate sector, or measures to achieve that, was considered as a kind of a luxury to in countries like us, in Turkey too, at the same time. I remember talking to the officials here 5 to 7 years ago about this issue. And that's what I was told at that time. So many priorities in the country, this is the least of our concerns at the moment. Yeah. But now it is not like that. Because for the first time in history, I think it's a luxury now to be out of this new industrial policy framework that's developing in the developed countries, in the advanced countries. Because if these new technologies are going to transform the existing sectors rapidly in 5 years, in 10 years, that means it's possible for countries like Turkey and Mexico to lose their international competitiveness if we don't act accordingly, if we don't follow this development, more closely. So I think there is an argument there. If the politicians, you asked Alberto about what the politicians might do. If the politicians decide to stay out of that process, then our countries are going to lose their competitiveness, and that's bad for, wealth generation, for growth, and also job creation process in our countries. So I think there is a case for that. But in the case of Turkey now, in Ankara, do we have a full understanding of the severity of this situation? No, we don't. There are many different agencies, and if you go to the Ministry of Environment, they understand the discussion. But if you go to the Ministry of Industry, in the Ministry of Trade, they understand the severity of the situation because the EU is already, working on some measures. But in the Ministry of Industry and in the other ministries, we still need a kind of a, more cooperation, more understanding of the severity of this situation, I think. And of course, in the case of Turkey, unlike Mexico, we have a problem with the Paris Agreement too. Turkey is one of the first countries to sign the agreement in 2016, but we still haven't ratified the agreement. So we are with, I think there are now 6 remaining countries who weren't ratified the agreement, like, Iraq, Syria, even Syria ratified it.
Syria ratified it, yeah.
Syria ratified it. A few weeks ago, South Sudan also ratified the Paris Agreement. So the first thing that Turkey needs to do, I think, is to ratify the agreement.
Paris Agreement.
With that, I think, with that ratification process, I think we are all going to understand that, Ankara is really following what's happening in our major market at the moment. But we are not there yet. Yeah. But I think this is a very important issue in terms of the international competitiveness of the Turkish economy in the short term. Let me underline that.
Yeah.
If you don't move fast, then it is possible to lose competitiveness.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, some time ago, when we talked about Turkey ratifying the Paris Agreement, the sentiments around the topic was that national interests. And even the business associations were trapped in that national interest concept. And I think now it is obvious that there is no national interest as such to be protected and supported if you're not a part of the global responsibility chain and a part of the global deal, whether call it green or new Green New Deal or deal. But we are on the same boat, all of us in this planet. And if we do not assume our responsibilities, it's going to work against the national interest anyway. So that the discussion seems to be over.
Yeah, there is no argument for national interest when it comes to the Paris Agreement. I mean, I know all the questions, all the issues that were raised. They are all false. Let me say.
Absolutely, absolutely, right. Alberto.
Well, I think one message for companies, I would say, regardless of the status of policy, is we don't have to wait for policy to be there for companies to show the leadership that is needed in this transition, right? I think policy plays a role of enabling the transition, but the transition will only happen if we have corporate leadership. And I don't think we would have the economy that we have today, including all the convenience that we have through the digital platforms and stuff like that, if it hadn't been through innovation and vision and leadership from companies. So I think we need policy for sure, but we don't have the policy incentives that we have. That should not be used as an excuse for companies not to take leadership. We need leadership, and I think the faster that companies start taking action, the more prepared they're going to be for this transition. And also that sends a clear signal also to policymakers, right? It's very different when you have companies that are holding or opposing the transition compared to a situation where you have companies, more and more companies aligning to this transition globally. And that sends also an incentive for policymakers to actually adjust to the new reality. So yeah, if I were to send one message, it would be that I think we need policy, but not having policy signals is not an excuse not to take action.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much. I think we covered a lot of ground, and of course, there's much more to discuss in this space. But I think at least we together with your help, Professor Sak and Alberto Carrillo, we drew the picture in front of the companies and regulators, if they're watching us, that there is no going back, and it's a new era of changing our practices, sharing it with our investors and our stakeholders. And let's see how this process will take us through what we call human epoch. And in the launch of Human Development Index a few weeks ago, I said, well, whether this epoch will remain as human epoch or whether we will be able to turn it into a humane epoch will depend on to what extent we will assume our responsibilities as governments, managers of companies, scholars, activists, and every individual citizen. Thank you so much for your contributions. I benefited a lot from this discussion, and I hope our audience also enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thanks to you.